All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Greta. So this is the second segment of our series, sort of diving back into collectibles, the history of collectibles. And today we're going to be sort of moving on to the next big, I guess you'd say, technological advance that honestly, I think we could both agree has even more to do with what we see in modern collecting today, which is the introduction of photography.
Yeah, photography was really a game changer in how people looked at imagery, which sounds like a very obvious statement. But prior to the invention of photography, the owning of imagery was very limited. It was really only accessible to the upper classes, and a big component of that was owning images of yourself. So
Right.
if you were an upper class person, you had the means to hire an artist to paint a portrait of you or your family members or, whatever. And so you had records of what members of your family looked like going back generations. And that was something that was like totally inaccessible to everybody else. And photography, that is the number one thing that it changed. And it's also, in my opinion, the reason that photography took off the way that it did, the way that it spread across, the Western world at the rate that it did, was there was something incredibly seductive about that idea of owning an image of yourself. And
Right.
it's really a big part of like the collecting piece of it. You would give photographs to other people.
Right.
And like the first time we really saw that take off was during the Civil War, at least in the United States.
Oh,
It
that's
was,
interesting.
yeah, so it was very common. Like if you think about it, if you're a soldier, and you're about to go into battle, they actually had photographers that sort of followed around the troop encampments. And I actually, in doing research in graduate school, actually found ancestors of mine who were tintypists who made, I can show you. Tintype is just like a little photograph that's like printed on a sheet of tin,
Good.
who were photographers during the Civil War. And they wrote about how, today we had the biggest, business day ever. We made over 1,000 tintypes. And this was on the eve of a battle. And photographers, or sorry,
And was this all commissioned by the military?
no, it was just sort of like this secondary commerce that built itself up.
So
That sort of followed around.
the soldier
Yes.
themselves would be like, "Hey, actually, could you take a picture of me?"
Yes. Yep. So you
Oh,
would.
interesting.
Yep. And like a tintype was something that you got back really immediately.
Like an
And
old Polaroid, almost.
exactly. And it was also just one of one. So you only had one of those. So you might pay to get multiple ones. Now, like, and I also have examples of this is an actual photograph from the Civil War of a soldier that would have been like sent home. Any that you see printed on paper, the way that this one is, was done with a glass plate negative, which meant it was reproducible. So if you were an officer or you could pay for that, then this is what you did, because then you could get, a dozen of these made to send back to your mother and your sweetheart and your grandmother, who else, whoever.
Sure.
And that was really like the advent of having basically albums of your family members and your friends. Like a photograph became something meaningful that you gave to somebody else. It also brought in the first idea of like collecting, because if you were somebody famous, if you were wealthy, you paid to have these made. And enterprising photographers would look at that and say, okay, well, I just took a photograph of Abraham Lincoln, for example.
Right.
I could sell copies of this print to the general public. And that's what they did. So it was also like very common during the Civil War that
Make
you
some
would
merch.
have, was that?
Yeah, like make some merch.
Exactly. Yeah. That you would have like an album, and let's say you'd have an album of every major general or officer serving. So like as you're going, reading your newspaper about, the Battle of Antietam or something, you would actually have pictures of the major, generals and officers to go along with that.
And
And that
this is
was
the
also,
first time in history, like during a wartime, like you're actually looking at the people involved in the battle. I mean, this is revolutionary, right? Like this is,
yeah, it was huge.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've never known what they look like being that
Right.
person. Wow.
Yeah, you might have seen like etchings that were printed in newspapers, but we don't see photographs printed in newspapers or magazines until the 20th century. So like literally your only way to have a good, accurate representation of somebody was to have a photograph. And this was also a common practice in places like Europe. Now, they weren't necessarily getting pictures of American generals, but all of your favorite actors or actresses that you might see in a
Sure.
play. The royal family was huge in places like Great Britain. All of your favorite poets or writers, anybody who was in sort of like the upper echelon of society in some way, people collected photographs of them. So you can also think of this as like the first
Trading card.
advent of that like celebrity culture. And like like Charles Darwin, for example, people knew what he looked like. So if you disagreed with what he wrote in The Origin of Species, like you'd recognize him on the street and could tell him to his face.
Right.
So it like removes that anonymity that we largely had prior to that as well. So like that was a really big changer just in sort of how we thought about like culture. It really like it changed our interaction with the rest of the world.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, because the photography was first sort of invented in what, like 1830 or so?
Yeah, so the first like patent you have of a photographic process is in the end of 1830s. There had been experimentation for probably about a decade before that, but nothing that was like
This
available.
is going to work every time.
Yeah, this is going to work every time. It's going to be reliable. The first time you actually have something that resembles a camera is actually during the Renaissance. And it was a device called the camera obscura. So it looked very much like the cameras that they end up using in the 1830s, but they struggled for literally hundreds of years to actually record an image and have it last. Because sometimes they would get it to like record on a piece of paper or cloth or something like that. But then over time or exposed to light, like it just disappeared. So that was like the big holdup, was the technical piece of like, how do I make this image actually last once I have it captured?
That's awesome. And so this makes me sort of wonder too, because it's just so hard to not think about it like this, especially, when we see sort of the rise of popularity of like the old tobacco insert baseball cards. I mean, those photographs are not dissimilar from the ones that you just showed me, the Civil War generals, almost the same size even. And, so you've got your baseball players, and are we also starting to see, like a signature, like get your photo signed by the person who it was taken of? Or, I mean, I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but it does sort of remind me of like, well, if I can own a photo of this famous person or this person, but then I see Charles Darwin at the bar, maybe I just go, well, what would make this even better is if I have him actually sign it.
Yeah.
That.
I know less about the history of like collecting autographs, but I would think that would have gone hand in hand, because I think that, just like you talked about last week with like the printing press and having books, like that was a big thing. If you met the author, you would have them write an inscription to you. Now, I do know that photographs were not generally sold with a signature on it, because that would mean that the photographer would have to cut in the person whose picture it was of, and they weren't about to do that. They probably weren't even getting permission to be selling their image to other people. So that sort of concept of like copyright and ownership of your own image is a totally 20th century idea.
Oh, yeah.
It did not exist then.
Oh yeah, that's like that. Yeah, the law can never keep up with technology. It's always lagging way far behind in terms of something like that. Because I mean, if you were to take photos of Abraham Lincoln nowadays and just try to sell them, you know what I mean? You might have an issue. Well, that's really interesting. So then, sort of moving forward, we begin sort of with the Civil War and almost keepsakes, and I imagine too just the massive casualties. Soldiers wanting to get pictures taken because it might be the last time you ever see them.
Well, and then this is another sort of like weird byproduct of that, is that because the majority of the fighting during the Civil War was on the East Coast, but you did have soldiers coming from the Midwest and West, their bodies would be shipped back via train usually, or in a wagon or something like that. So it was also very common practice. If you knew who the soldier was, sometimes they would have a photographer photograph the body before shipping it, because it's going to arrive in a state where the family is not going to want to look at it. It was actually also the first time that we see the use of embalming was done during the Civil War, just for preservation of bodies, but was not a widespread practice until like later in the 1800s. But this also ties into a really big part of American culture during that time, was not just because of the Civil War, but just because of, you know, high child mortality rates. Like your own life expectancy was like fairly low for that time period. There was just this sort of general, I don't want to say obsession, but to some degree an obsession with death. And photography also became a really big part of that as well. And then that practice was also widely done in the home as well, because there were no funeral homes. There's very high mortality rate among children and just people in general, because we don't have antibiotics yet or anything like that. That if you could afford it and a family member died, you hired a photographer to come and photograph the dead. And in almost all cases, they are posed to look like they're alive, especially in the 1800s. So you have, especially with the kids, like they're dressed and they're seated in a chair. There's usually like all the living siblings gathered around them. And it was seen as, it's probably quite the experience for...
Whoa, God.
But you have to remember, like, it was so common. Like, that's why people had a dozen children, because you didn't expect them all to make it to even early childhood.
Death was just such a ever-present part of your life.
Yes, it was.
That sitting next to your dead sister for an hour while a weird guy wandered around with his camera didn't seem like as morbid as we would consider it to be today.
No, and it's actually the ones that are like, you know, well done are actually hard to spot, because the person has their eyes open and you can only tell because there's like a slightly vacant look about them, that there's a dead person in it. But then, and actually...
Baby pictures that would 100% be called out as just being dead. I like just zoned out in my high chair. My God. That's crazy. So people, I mean, this is a very personal item, I would imagine. But were there collectors of these, like, even back then? I mean, because now, of course, they're an antique that's sort of a bygone era of and a weird sort of, if you will, snapshot into, like, death in culture, right? Like,
so you probably would not give out copies of the post-mortem photographs, but what you would give out, and I have some examples
nice.
from my own personal collection.
Yeah. In case everybody doesn't know, Greta has a lot of these.
So these are an example of something you would give out. So these are like basically death notices. So it's like telling you who the person is, when they died, and you would give these out to acquaintances. You would also do things like give out like black gloves to wear, black armbands. There was this whole like industry that surrounded the idea of like people dying. You had, sometimes you would give out like pieces of jewelry, like lockets that would have a piece of the hair of the deceased person in it. You would sometimes put those on gravestones. So there was this whole sort of like culture that surrounded like memorializing the person who died, and sort of sharing that with the community. And obviously like the better off you were economically, like the more of those things that you did, that was sort of like a marker of like your social and economic status, was the ability to do that.
I see. So how well you were able to mourn was a direct correlation to how much money you had.
Yeah, or at least publicly.
Publicly you're trying to show off, even in death.
Yes.
Yeah, that tracks. So in these death notices, there's no photos. It's just sort of hey,
it's just like a printed card, sort of similar. Like if you went to a viewing or a funeral today, there's usually some sort of little leaflet thing that you take with you
in memoriam or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
Right. That makes sense. Well, that's great. I mean, because nowadays, obviously, funerals are ludicrously, the industry didn't die. I mean, there's death and taxes, right? Like, but it seems like the ceremony was much more present back then in terms of just a community-wide sort of getting together. But that is interesting because obviously today I feel like obviously it'll change depending from person to person, but I feel like a funeral is definitely seen as a very private affair. And maybe I feel like viewings are much less common nowadays too. Like I just feel like in general, but maybe I'm off base there, but just we almost don't want to think about the dead. So in a way, just having a thing of ashes is way easier for us to deal with because it's somehow not them anymore.
Well, and I think that if you think about like our perspective on life and death is very different than it was 150 years ago because your life expectancy was fairly short back then and there were such high mortality rates among the young. Death was in your face all the time. So it wasn't something that you could pretend didn't exist. And I think that led to people embracing it more because it was just everywhere and all the time.
Yeah, you can't pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. So today, because we're all thinking, I'm going to live till I'm in like my 90s or, I'm 100 years old, you don't want to think about that. You don't want to like face your own mortality by really embracing like the death of somebody else and, having that same sort of ceremonial components that go along with it. We really only see that with like heads of states and,
right.
guys or things like that.
Something very, very, very big. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I know we got a little off track. I just know it's just a very fascinating thing to sort of see how it's evolved to today and sort of like the fact that these are now antiques, right? Like, I mean, these are
super collectible. So I don't have any examples in my own personal collection of early postmortem photographs, but I do have, these are ones that like are a little bit later. This is a child one, which is sad. Yep. But so when we did start to have like funeral homes, then you would get pictures of bodies in the casket.
Right.
And so like, that's an example of one. This is another example.
Oh my goodness.
Wow. So you can tell that there's like, this was into the 20th century at this point.
Right.
But this also made it a more public thing, like the actual photographing. So that practice of taking a photograph of the dead only persists like the latest, the 30s and 40s. And then it's like nearly out of existence.
I feel like once World War I and World War II happened, that kind of, I think, really messed with a lot of people in terms of like just there was so much death. I think really coming out of World War II, I feel like just nobody wanted to think about it. Like,
yeah, those wars were more oppressive, I think. Yeah. I mean, like the horror, like obviously the Civil War was horrific given the sheer number of Americans that died.
But it was also on our home soil too.
Yeah.
Right? Like it was much more in our face, whereas we would just have people just shipped back. You don't see the war, you see headlines, but realistically your friend or your brother or husband or whoever just got on a boat and then just never came back.
Yeah, and that's also like that era. So not during World War I, but by the time World War II happens, we have the first like photo-based magazines. So in like 36 and 37 is when Life magazine started and Look magazine started.
And I would imagine those earlies are extremely valuable if you have copies of sort of the very beginning of imagery in sort of a newspaper or magazine or not so much.
Well, maybe. The thing is they were like so popular. Like, Life magazine alone was in 50% of households in the United States.
Wow.
So there was a lot of them printed, but that was really the start of the idea of like the photographic essay, which is like telling a picture or telling a story with pictures. And it was also the rise of sort of like your well-known photographers, because you would know the kind of topics that they covered. You would get a sense of their style, and it really changed our relationship with like the stories that we were reading. And they were like very influential in sort of culture at that time period. So if you like saw this photographic story about something, you felt like you knew it in a way that you didn't necessarily when you're just reading text.
Right.
So,
and of course, we also have moving pictures at this point. So just the whole image-based, like, just your brain is much more attuned to stimulus via imagery as opposed to just text, right?
Yeah, people became more sophisticated in sort of their interpretation of imagery at that time.
Right. And so I wanted to also touch upon, because obviously, you know, this whole series about the history of collecting, and I think this is all really important stuff to understand context and sort of where all this came from and why was it happening, because like you said, to us, the idea of taking these photographs is completely insane. Like this, like, if I heard my neighbor was doing this, I'd probably try to have them arrested. You know what I mean? Like, it would be crazy. But, you know, like you said, 150 years ago, it's a completely different time and place. But we had briefly sort of, before, you know, we recorded I think it was last week, talked about photographers who sort of did begin to understand that especially the popular ones, that if they can make sort of their own one-of-ones. And so even if you duplicate their image, it's not going to be the same duplication. So you have the same image, but it's done slightly differently. And so every single image, while maybe taken from the same shot, is in and of itself completely different. And therefore, you know, it really harkens back, I think, or not harkens back, harkens forward, quite frankly, to sort of the sports cards, right? Of like, it's the same player, but it's a different color wave. It's a different refractor. It's a different, you know, patch auto, whatever. So, you know, it might be the same, it might even be the same image of Trevor Lawrence or whoever, but because of the changes they've made to it, it really adds to collectability and sort of value in a way, depending on which one you have. Obviously, this was not quite that intense, but I forget the guy's name, but I was just wondering if you wanted to talk for a second about the father of the one of one.
All right, so it's interesting because like photography, you can use as like a precursor to a lot of the things that you see in collectible cards in general. One is that like photography was the first thing that was like, aside from the book, was really, really reproducible. As soon as you have a negative, you could make literally 1 million identical prints from it. So that in and of itself sort of like lends to our thoughts about trading cards where, you know, you don't own the only one. There's like millions of that card out there. Photography was the first thing that did that, really, where people collected it. On the other hand, because of the reproducibility, photography had a very difficult time being accepted as fine art because it was not the only one. So how can you make the case to somebody who collects paintings or sculptures that they should pay a substantial amount of money for this photograph when they know that there's literally a limitless number of identical copies of that could be out there?
Right.
So the way that the artists, the photographers who wanted to be accepted into the art world addressed this was a movement called pictorialism. And a big component of that was either making their images look like they were hand-drawn, so they would take like really blurry focused pictures and things like that. But the other thing that they did is they started using color chemicals in the darkroom to change every version of a print that they made. And the guy who led that was named Alfred Stieglitz, and he would be like hugely important in the 20th century in terms of fine art photography, but somebody who really made a name for himself making one-of-one prints was Edward Steichen, who, a copy of one of his images sold at an auction in 2009 for $2.9 million. It wasn't the only print he made of that, but it was the only one that looked in that particular way. So they really leaned
when you
into
say
that.
The color treatments, are we talking about like sepia tones versus, something?
This was actually like the very first use of color. So they didn't use color film, but they were using multiple chemicals to create different shades. So sepia is sort of like our standard, like, oh yeah, all pictures from, the 1800s look that way. Not because they toned them that way, but actually because of the use of, for the most part, egg yolks in the creation of the photographic paper. But these guys and women, because there were some women among them, they were using different kinds of chemicals. They were using platinum and palladium and Van Dyke Brown and like all these other things to create like a wide range of tones and toning different parts of the print to give it a certain look. That would soon sort of be rejected as like, that's such a like, a gimmick, I guess you could say. So it was only around for a short period of time.
Which of course makes it probably a very interesting collectible piece now, because it just wasn't done for very long.
Yeah, and it was sort of a rigged system at that time too, because Alfred Stieglitz had such a stranglehold on like photographic art in the United States. Like, he told people whose art was worth collecting, who was worth like showing in museums and things like that. So he really dictated like where value laid at that particular time. And then by the time like we enter sort of modernism, which was in a large part sort of a reaction to like what had happened in World War I and sort of like going into World War II, it's sort of this whole new like ideology that a lot of the world took on. They sort of reject some of those like tropes that we see early in the 20th century. And then sort of fine art photography becomes its own thing. It sort of divorces itself from subject matter, and it's like all embracing like abstraction and, sort of that avant-garde things that we see with like cubism and surrealism that were happening around that time period. And it becomes sort of fully accepted as art in its own right.
Right. Well, it's funny that the other thing was seen as gimmicky, when it sounds to me like it has a lot more to do with painting than just having your egg yolk, whatever, what I mean, and just leaving it as sepia. It sounds to me like they were really taking a very hands-on approach to creating colors in certain areas and, in a way, painting the image with chemicals. I mean, in a way.
They were. And that was part of the problem. So like later photographers would say, we shouldn't need to do that in order to be considered artists. We shouldn't need to make ourselves look like painters when we're actually photographers.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. But that's so interesting. I have to say, those 10 in particular photos that you have really do. I mean, that's such an incredible just piece of. Yeah, I mean, it almost looks like a trading card. Of course, completely different context. But thank you. So I think we've gone down the rabbit hole far enough. We're hitting our 30-minute mark here. But I do really think that this is just an interesting place to start, because if we're going to be talking about the history of collectibles, how can you not talk about it without talking about the imagery and where the idea of, collecting sets, collecting, people who you don't know personally, right? But these aren't your friends. These are people you know of, and that's where it stops. And your relationship to them is solely in this thing that you have in your hands that you bought.
But it's like creating that connection that is in some way desirable and is something that you can brag to your friends about and show off. Like, it becomes a point of pride that you've managed to like collect these certain things.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting segue and sort of just a little teaser for next week, in case anybody is interested, is a nice segue into sort of because these are people, and obviously I think it's a pretty easy one-to-one connection on sports cards because obviously those are real people.
Right.
Do I know Trey Lance? No, but I can have a card of him and have that relationship to you, like, oh, he's a big piece of my collection or whatever. But it is going to be interesting, I think, to sort of see the cultural shift to where all of a sudden something like a Pikachu can now take that place. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where we've transcended just needing it to be an actual person, and actually this collectability is no longer based off of, oh, I know this person or I know that they did this. It actually, like, I think we'll see sort of beginning, honestly, around the time we were talking about 30s and 40s with the comic books coming out and characters in comic books starting to take on a life of their own in the imagination of the kids reading them, even after they've sort of started to grow up, I think is where we start to see the acceptance of, like, this fictional thing, but, like, I have a relationship to it,
Yeah, because you can ask any child or adult, like, what superhero you would be. You can ask any Pokemon collector, what Pokemon would you have?
Exactly. And everyone's got an answer for you.
Yeah, and it feels very personal.
Something they've thought about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a great place to leave off because, like I said, I think it'll dovetail really nicely into the next segment, which is going to sort of be focusing on, sort of how we got from people to then, this next level of collecting. But thank you so much, Greta. I do appreciate you taking the time, and I'll see you at our next marketing meeting.
Sounds good. Thanks, Thom.
All right. Thanks, Greta.